I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Editing Podcast. This week we're talking about editorial events like online and in-person conferences, professional away days and webinars.
And in particular, we're going to chat about 10 tips for beginner presenters, because there's no doubt that for a lot of editors and proofreaders, the idea of presenting for the first time can feel a bit daunting.
It certainly can. I can remember my first presentation for the Chartered Institute of Editing and Proofreading. I was so nervous, and I still get nervous.
Oh, me too. I remember my first time and how the conference director phoned me and asked me if I'd do one, and I said yes, and then I sat there afterwards bricking it, wondering whether I should call her back and say I'd made a mistake. But yeah, the nerves still haven't gone away.
Yeah, but it's normal to feel nervous about live events, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's probably the first thing to acknowledge. But we're also going to give you 10 practical tips to help you say yes if you're asked to present, things that will help you to get organised.
And that way, even if you're still bricking it, at least you know that the content you're going to deliver is engaging, the way you'll present it is digestible, and that the right people are in the session.
Yeah, that's right. So, tip number 1 is to start with a strong title. Now, we've dedicated a whole episode to this issue, so we'll keep things brief today. And the main thing is to create a title that's specific and clear.
The reason for that is so that everyone who signs up knows what they're going to be getting and why the webinar or the event or the session is useful for them.
Yeah, because you don't want people feeling disappointed because they thought they were going to get one thing when in fact your focus was somewhat different.
Exactly. So think about whether you need to identify the audience, whether they're editors or proofreaders, whether the editorial specialism is relevant, or whether including the level, beginner, intermediate or advanced would be helpful.
Yeah, and obviously be specific about the focus of the information you're presenting. So what the problem solution is that you're focusing on.
Yeah. So tip 2 is to map out the structure. This is where you start to think about what the different sections are and in what order you're going to present them.
Yeah, so mapping things out like this, people sometimes refer to this stage as the scope and sequence. And Louise, you and I have talked together about this before and how it really does help reduce any feelings of overwhelm because it brings order to the table.
It really does. Mm-hmm. And it's worth saying that for some people, it can help just to scribble down the section ideas first and then think about the order later.
Absolutely, because that way, again, you're reducing your mental load, focusing on the content and what needs to be included.
Yeah, and then you can sit back and ask yourself, is the order working? Does each section flow logically from the previous one?
Or is anything missing that means a new section will be necessary? And sometimes it might seem like maybe the presentation is going to be too long. And that can help you make decisions about how maybe you've bitten off more than you can chew.
Definitely. And perhaps your presentation just needs narrowing in scope. And if that's the case, you can refine your content and the title that supports it. I think it's always worth stepping back and asking yourself, am I delivering an event presentation here or a full-on training course?
Exactly, because we can get carried away, can't we?
Yeah.
When we're creating content for a single session, we're not trying to teach all the things or solve all the problems.
Exactly. We need to be realistic about what we can offer in the time we've been allotted and then create the content around that.
Yeah. So tip number 3 is to identify the learning outcomes right at the top of the webinar after the introduction. That should be the first item that you plan to deliver once you've welcomed everyone and reiterated what the purpose of the session is.
This is one of those things that presenters often omit, and yet it's such a pithy and useful thing for the audience to know, and it tells people what's in it for them, why it's been worth their while to turn up.
Yeah, exactly. What knowledge they'll have gained or the next steps they'll be able to take after they've digested what they've learned.
Yeah. And the way we both tend to approach this is pretty blunt. Something on the lines of, by the end of this session, you should know how to do A, B and C. Or by the end of this session, you'll understand the foundations of X, Y and Z.
Yeah, and that learning outcomes section shouldn't be difficult to create because each outcome will be related to the learning in each section. And it's a really good exercise during the preparation stage because if you're not able to say what the learning outcomes are, there's probably something wrong with your content.
Yeah, that's so true.
It's basic.
Planning stage, it really helps to focus the mind. So you can ask yourself, what am I hoping to teach people here? What's the purpose of what I'm talking about? What am I hoping to achieve? What's the outcome for them?
Definitely, because it's a tool that helps the presenter and the audience and makes you as a presenter focus on what the audience is getting. It's not about you, it's about them.
Yeah. So on the subject of helping the audience, tip 4 is that you consider numbering the sections in your presentation and incorporating them into your slides and maybe even into the title.
Yeah, now we talked about this in the episode we did on titles specifically, how numbers are brilliant signals that really help make a presentation digestible, particularly because delegates might be having to take in a lot of information at multiple sessions.
Yeah, and what we'd say is use them up front. So perhaps in your introduction, tell people that the presentation is divided into 5 sections or whatever.
Yeah, and that way those numbers become simple little tools that enable your audience to track whether they're at the beginning, middle or end of your session. You're really helping them to understand how the session's structured and how they can mentally pace themselves through it. If they know where they are in relation to the whole session.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about slide content. So tip 5 is to keep your slides as decluttered as possible. The usual school of thought is minimal text, maximal imagery, meaning the bulk of the learning will come out of your mouth.
Yeah, and the slides are where you can represent those words visually. So maybe you'll use a slide to share an infographic or a photograph or a piece of data.
Yeah, like a chart or a graph. Or it could just be an amusing image that captures the essence of what you're talking about and that gives your audience a little chuckle.
Yeah. Now, we're not suggesting you should exclude words, but rather that you should keep them short and sweet and formatted in a way that's easy to digest, like tables and bullet lists.
Yeah. And if you're presenting in person, those words can be excellent visual triggers for you. So things on the screen that remind you of what you need to talk about and in what order.
Yeah, and if you do need to place large amounts of text on the slide, maybe an excerpt from a piece of prose that demonstrates the point you're making, then make sure the font is clear and large enough.
Yeah, and use bold and colours to highlight elements that your audience needs to pay attention to. Basically, what we're saying is make it as easy as possible for them to identify the information you want them to focus on.
And another trick to bear in mind if you've got a lot of textual information is to break it down into separate slides.
Yeah, so if you have a table with 9 items in it that you're going to talk about, then create 9 slides and make each new item visible only as you discuss it. And that way your audience isn't confronted with information until they need it.
Yeah. And there's just one other thing which I picked up from my husband Andy, who does presentation skills training, and he says if there is no way around it and you have to have a lot of text on your slides for whatever reason, maybe it's a client's information that you're sharing and they can be quite text heavy sometimes, can't they? Tell the audience up front that they don't need to make notes and have handouts prepared for them with all that information on it, because if you've got a lot of text on a slide, people will be wanting to write it all down, and then they're not focusing on what you're saying. So they're either trying to be writing it down or they're trying to read it while you're talking, and it's just confusing for everyone. So if that's going to be your way, have handouts ready for people, or tell them that you'll send them the slides afterwards so that they can relax knowing that they can access that information.
Good tip.
So now for tip number 6, and that is to offer a PDF transcript of what you say. And that's because one of those things, again, like I was saying with the slides, is it can act as a barrier with attendees desperately trying to take notes on everything you're saying.
Exactly, and just going back to your point about Andy, it's probably, we put this in at tip number 6, but actually, it's regardless of whether you're going to send the slide deck like he suggested or the handout, even if it's a transcript,
anything.
Give them it up front.
Yeah.
Because like you said, it means they're focused on writing rather than on you and just your slides. And sometimes nervous presenters can end up speaking a little fast. I know I do. I'm terrible for that. And then people start asking you to slow down, which can interrupt your flow and mess with your confidence.
It really can. And, and also the other thing to bear in mind is that sometimes sessions are recorded, but not always.
Yeah.
And having a PDF transcript of your script and making your slide deck available just means that people don't need to take notes. I
Yeah.
think it's worth bearing in mind, and it also relaxes people when they come into your session if they know at the top of it that they can just sit and focus on what you're saying and not worry about how they're recording it.
Yeah. And again, I think just as we were talking about, make sure this is in your introduction. Perhaps before you go through the learning outcomes, tell people up front that you'll be making something available for them, and they can just sit back and listen.
Definitely. Now, talking of listening, let's chat about what they're going to be listening to and how you're going to remember what to say. So tip 7 is to make scripting decisions that suit you. So how you go about this will depend on your preferences and also whether you're delivering online only or in person. So some people like to have a script where every single word they're going to say is prepared. They'll even use italics and caps to remind them where their emphasis is.
That's me.
That's you. It's not me.
And if you're using something like PowerPoint, you can place the script or notes underneath the screen content on a slide-by-slide basis. But the beauty is that when you're sharing your screen in presentation view, you can see that script, but your audience can't.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much because it gives the viewer a brilliant experience, but it gives the presenter security. And I like to mine just tend to have bullet points just to make sure I don't miss things. But how about if you're in the room with people? So let's talk about that because that's a bit trickier, isn't it?
Yeah. So one option is to use that script space under each space for bullet points, a bit like you do, Denise, that you need to talk about. Again, your audience won't be able to see them.
Another option is to ditch the computer and write your notes on postcards, and that's sometimes good for people who want to move around a bit.
Yeah. Another option is to learn the whole lot off by heart. Some people can do that. For others, that's a nightmare that might make the prospect of presenting impossible.
Unless you build your slide deck so that every slide contains keywords or images that will act as nudges and remind you of the point that you need to make. Now, that might work for some people.
Or you can just go down the whole script route again. I think the key of pulling that off is to make sure that you look up at your audience every couple of seconds. That way you're still focusing on them more than you're looking down at your notes.
Yeah. And the thing is, some people are born performers, but lots of editors aren't. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves about what works best for us and the kind of people we are.
Yeah, and if being able to take one particular approach means the difference between us presenting and not presenting, I think that's fine.
Oh, definitely. And we're an international and diverse community, and that's generally incredibly respectful of and sensitive to people's different needs and preferences. So go down the route that suits you.
Exactly. So why don't we talk about taking questions, deciding on a structure and handling tricky ones?
Yeah, let's. So, tip number 8 is to allow time for questions when you're planning your session. The issue to consider is when you'll take them. And our recommendation is that you state your preference up front right at the top of the session.
And that way you're in control. So depending on how participative the session is, you'll need to decide whether to allow questions throughout the presentation or ask attendees to wait until the Q&A at the end.
Yeah, now the on-the-go approach works well for interactive sessions that have a more sort of workshopy feel to them. Whereas the at-the-end approach means that you won't feel derailed by a single attendee who perhaps isn't digesting information at the same pace as everyone else.
And Q&As can feel like extra pressure for nervous presenters. We get that. And the thing me and you always try to remind ourselves when we've chatted about this is that it's okay to say, I don't know, but I'll go away and think about it and I'll send you an email.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it comes back to that performance issue and how, for a lot of people, it's hard taking questions on the hoof. And if I don't answer a question perfectly, or I can't find the answer right there and then, because I'm feeling a bit flustered, then, and that's an issue for someone, frankly, well, you know,
They can bug off. They can bug off if that's an issue for them.
Yeah.
You've come forward to do the presentation and try to do your best. It's okay not to be perfect. It's okay not to have an answer on the tip of your tongue. It's okay not to understand a question or to misinterpret it.
Yeah, and it's okay also to stumble over your words, not just during the Q&A, but during the presentation. It's okay to forget what you were going to say. It's okay to be human.
It really is. So do allow time for questions, but have an "I'm not sure," or "I'll have to think about that," or "I can find out for you" in your back pocket. Chances are you won't need them, but having those options ready is just fine.
Yeah, so let's move on to tip 9. Now, this is about practicing. So we both like to practice our presentations out loud. Now, there are a couple of benefits to this. The first is that it allows you to get a sense of the timing.
And it doesn't have to be exact, but you don't want to end up in a situation where you run out of time at the live event and you're only halfway through the content.
Oh, definitely not. And the thing is that content often takes far longer to go through than you sort of realise when you first sort of create it. So
Definitely.
the second benefit is that it helps you practice using and pacing your voice. Beginner presenters aren't necessarily used to speaking out loud, and it can feel a bit weird.
It really can. And if you're presenting in person, practice moving your eye between your notes or script and up at your audience. Remember how we just talked about looking at attendees every couple of seconds? That kind of quick switching doesn't feel natural to everyone, but just practicing it can get you used to doing it.
Yeah. Great. So, our 10th and final tip is about what to include in your introduction. Now, it might seem a bit odd that we've left this until last, but we thought it would be a good recap of the things that have already come up as we've been talking.
Yeah, that's right. So here's a template you can use. So start by thanking your audience for joining you and then introduce yourself, sharing your name and pronouns. You might also want to mention your role and any relevant qualifications or experience you think will help establish your credibility.
Then remind people what the title of the session is, in other words, what the focus is and who it's aimed at.
Yeah. Then tell people how the session will be structured, how many sections there'll be, and what format those sessions will take if there's a mixture.
Then make it clear when questions are welcome.
And finally, say what supporting materials available and whether the attendees need to take notes.
And then you can dive into your learning outcomes, the summary of what's in it for them. The whole thing should only take a couple of minutes, not more.
Indeedy. So that's it from us. Thank you once again for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, if you would like to help support the Editing Podcast, we've got a couple of options for you. The first is that you can tip us with a one-off donation of your choosing.
Or you can join our Patreon community. All our patrons get exclusive access to a huge batch of transcripts.
Both the links are in the show notes. In the meantime, she's been Louise.
And she's been Denise. Join us again soon.
Bye.